Hello and welcome to day 19 of Garden-tober, and today we're going to tackle this landscape. I am so excited. Our prompt for today is Swan Lake, and I kind of debated whether I was going to do a landscape or draw a swan, but I've decided to go with a landscape, a lakescape if you will, and I'm so excited. If you're new to Garden-tober, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Basically, I'm spending a month. We've got drawing prompts that we're going through, and we're either painting or drawing. I'll have all of that, including the playlist for this, linked down below if you're interested in just kind of joining people on a quick drawing challenge or painting challenge. It's an art challenge, really. But anyway, today we're going to do a landscape, and it's a little bit different for me. I tend to go with more expressive, more, not abstract, but less realistic, a little bit looser landscapes. And today we're going to go a little bit more realistic, and I'd like to go a little bit moodier than I normally do. So I'm excited to dive in. We're going to use the same colors we've been using throughout this challenge, except we are going to add in the Pearling Green. So that means I'm pulling in Windsor Yellow, Windsor Red, Ultramarine Blue, and then the Pearling Green. I love Pearling Green. I think it's such a good color just in general to have in your kit. But if you have a cool tone green that you can add a little bit of black to, you'll get something nice and close. If you've done a lot of my tutorials before, you have transparent yellow. That is very, very similar to Windsor Yellow and would be a great alternative. Okay, so let's get started mixing some of our greens. I'm kind of thinking something a little bit more cool tone for this project. So we've got our green. I mixed a little bit with our Windsor Blue to get kind of this beautiful muted sky tone. I'm going to take both of those and add that to our yellow. See if we can get a nice warm green in here that we'll need. And then I need a muted yellow tone as well, which that is not. But if we add a little bit of white to it, let me pull my white out. Add some Chinese white over here. Pull in with a clean brush. And this will just help mute it. If you want any color to become a pastel, add a little bit of white to it. And we've got a nice kind of duckling down white yellow color. All right, one thing I did do off camera was I added some masking fluid. This is totally optional. It's something that I decided to do this time around. I just used one of my brush and my dish soap trick. If you want to hear more about that, I have that in this video that I'll have up here. But I'm ready to get started with the painting. Let's dive in. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this large brush, which you don't need a brush this large. You can see that it's a little dirty, but that doesn't bother me. And I'm going to just wet this surface. And I'm actually going to keep going down. I did add a little bit of pigment to it. Yep, picking up. And then I'm going to just dab in kind of where our sky is going to be. So I'm going in between this tree area here, and I am bringing it down. I don't want to quite hit this section where I have this resist, so I should switch to a smaller little brush here. But I'm just kind of bringing this down. I don't want there to be a super defined line between where kind of the horizon line is and just kind of where the trees are falling. So I'm just placing this in here anywhere where there's going to be like some sky, which it's not a lot, admittedly. Then I'm going to clean that brush off. I'm going to grab a clean brush and I'm going to go in with our yellow. And this is just straight up yellow. It is very watered down. Quick glance. Very watered down. And I'm going to apply this in. Now you can see that some areas dried up a bit. So I'm going to take another clean brush with some clean water on it as soon as I can get it clean. There we go. And I'm just going to soften this edge. I do want it to bleed a little bit, not quite that much, but I want there to be some bleeding just to give us a nice soft edge. It's okay if the blue and the green, or the blue and the yellow mix a little bit, because they'll just make some green, which the leaves of our trees, our deciduous trees, are going to be green anyway. And we're just gonna bring that down here. I'm gonna clean off my brush a little bit just to pull that down a little bit, that kind of goldeny area, so that we have a nice soft edge. This paper dries a little faster than the paper I'm used to working with, as you've probably noticed. So it just means that we kind of have to go back in and we'll wet an area beyond where we want to place everything, and then put that color in. That way the color will have room to spread without necessarily spreading too far. Looks like I got some of the soap from the resist on my brush. It's not happy. Well, that could cause problems later, but we'll just kind of go with what we've got for now. All right, cleaning my brush off real good. I'm going to grab a little bit more of our blue to kind of bring in here. This is kind of another layer, bringing that down. Cleaning my brush, wiping it off. I am working quickly here just because I want these bleeds to be a little bit nicer. You don't have to jump back and forth as much as I am currently doing if your paper is staying wet. And then we're going to move down here. It is a little bit wet, but just to kind of build up some of these sections while this area dries. And then once this is dry, we can go over and start to add our green second pass. So we're going to take our green. This is going to be mostly the praline green, but it's going to be watered down. So we're just working on that first pass still. So we're really not adding a ton of depth and intensity yet. We're really just kind of setting the tone. Just so you know, so our light source is coming kind of from this section, and we're just kind of poking in through here. We've got this one will be, this tree here will be a little bit more silhouetted, and this area here will be a little bit deeper, and that will kind of allow this to be a little bit mysterious and fun. At least that's the goal. We'll see if it turns out that way. I'm going to start kind of see how watered down that is, and then some of this might be a little damp, and that's okay. I'm going to start kind of adding in some of this kind of future foliage, and be careful of our trunk. And then here I'm going to take just a little bit of our red and mix that in with the praline green. Again, just a little bit. I actually used too much here to get kind of a brown color. See how that's desaturated a bit? I could even take some of the yellow so that it's just a little bit warmer. I like that. And we're going to bring that in here. Oh, see, that's a little too gray. So I'm going to take a little more of our yellow, a touch more of the red, and kind of bring that down. I'm going to let those two kind of bleed together. And I'm going to actually continue that down all the way down here, kind of across. I want it to kind of look like there's a place to sit and look. I want it to look like an invitation. We're going to add a little bit more of our praline green in this corner here. Just kind of, I mean, honestly, to act a little bit as a vignette, we want to kind of close this area off because it's not the focus. We want it to force the eye to go this way. I'm actually going to mix it with our brown a little bit just to desaturate it a bit more. Not a lot. You can see how green that still is. And we'll let that kind of fade, and then we'll add a little bit more detail as we go. I'm actually kind of anxious to already start in on this tree up here. So we're going to go in with our cool green again. Well, I'm actually going to, it's pretty watery on my palette right now, so I'm going to dab it off on my towel, my little rag, and we're just going to just do our first and a chunk of the greenery. And with deciduous trees like these, so trees that lose their leaves, I find it best to kind of work on one section and like kind of finish that whole branch, and then work on the next section, and they might kind of touch or overlap a little bit, but they're their own section, and they might kind of be joined by this third section a little bit more. And we're not getting too dark, so not even as dark as we were down there. They might almost close. All right, I'm going to leave that as is. That'll just be our first pass. You know, I'm going to clean off my brush, dab it off so it's just damp, and I'm just going to soften some of these edges a little bit. I don't want anything to be too harsh quite yet. We can add in, we're going to add in more layers. So we want this section to be quite dark, but I don't want it to be black, especially yet. So some areas can be a little lighter, but I definitely want it to still be fairly soft, especially on some of these edges. Okay, and then we're going to work on this side. So I'm kind of working towards the lighter areas. You could say it's because I'm a little nervous about that, but it's going to be okay. So I'm just going to do the same thing on this side. We're just going to slowly work this way. I don't know if I mentioned it, but I'm working with a size 10 round brush. This is a Grumbacher Golden Edge. It's fine. I don't know, I wouldn't say there's anything super special about it. This side especially I want it to be a little softer because this is not going to be a focal point. This is in the background. So I'm adding a little more water. And I might even bring this down a bit. And carve out where that trunk is and bring it all the way down to kind of this glowing section. It's kind of illuminated. Cleaning my brush off, dabbing it off on the rag I have, and I'm just swiping this to kind of soften that edge. I'm going to do the same thing again, a little higher up, just to guarantee that it won't, hopefully, won't come all the way down. All right, we're just going to keep building that up. So we've got a branch there. I'm going to add here. We've got a fork in this tree here. And then here, I'm going to clean my brush off, grab a little bit of yellow, mix it in with our green. So this is a warmer green. And I'm going to bring that in here. I'm actually going to add more yellow. So it's going to be mostly yellow, a little bit of green. See, more like that. Cleaning my brush off, dabbing it off, making sure it's fairly dry because I don't want to add any more water into this situation. I'm just going to let that kind of bleed in, but trying to keep that color kind of concentrated. But trying to avoid blooms like this. All right, and then coming down, carving out that trunk again. And this one will be a little bit more focal, so I'm actually going to bring it down a little bit farther. See how my brush split like that? That's how you can tell it's pretty dry. I'm just going to drag that across, add a little bit more of our darker green in here to keep that from coming down too far. Cleaning my brush, wiping it off. All right, clean, wiped off brush. I'm going to go in with our green. And again, we're just kind of carving out these sections. Very lightly adding a little bit more water, dabbing it off so my brush is a little cleaner. Adding a little water, dabbing it off, even cleaner, just to allow this to kind of fade. See how we've created this feel that this is more illuminated than this area? Just a bit. Cleaning my brush off, dabbing it off, dragging it down here again to make sure that this line is nice and soft. All right, I'm going to do the same thing a little bit on this side and let it just kind of fade in. Obviously this section is a little more yellow. It should be better with an additional pass. Just trying to be patient here. Clean my brush off, wiping it off. I'm just going to bring some of that down so it's not like a harsh edge. Picking up a little more pigment. Cleaning my brush off, wiping it off. Are you sensing a theme? There's a lot of very light layers. All right, and we're not even going to keep going because we have a little bit of this vignette started. I'm going to continue with this tree, and then we'll just kind of keep bouncing around. This tape is not holding this paper very well. I might be spoiled now having experimented with different papers. All right, grabbing some praline green, adding some yellow to it. I need to mix some more. So we have a warmer green, which we certainly want to work with this tree here. And then I'm going to make sure we have some of our yellow pulled out as well. Some that's a little dirty, some that's a little less. I think some soap got into my yellow. Man, it's all sudsy. All right. A little more pigment. Dabbing it off is just a little too wet. I'll bring it down. And this is kind of, we're doing some negative painting, which I don't do a lot of, but that's, you know, working around some of these spots. And now I'm kind of doing the same thing, picking up a little bit of the praline to stick in this corner. I don't usually do this with my landscapes, but I kind of wanted to try it. A little bit of our dark praline again, just to kind of add in here. Back to the yellow, more yellow tone green. And I'm going to start working this way, but I'm not quite touching the sections that have the yellow in it yet. So I want to be able to add more to that. More of our yellow to that. Okay, now we're going in with yellow. So my brush is still dirty, but I'm just kind of building up to this area. And see how it looks like they kind of glow? That's kind of what I'm going for. The yellow green. All right, I'm going to take that same yellow green with our perylene and our Winsor yellow, mixing more of it right now, mixing that together, and we're going to move down here and do kind of the same thing we did up here along this strip of this foliage, and then we'll kind of work back a little bit. I'm wetting that down a bit. And just go along the edge of our water. And then I'm going to bring it up in some sections and let it go down. Cleaning my brush off. Could kind of do this with two brushes, to be perfectly honest. Grabbing some of our yellow, and we're going to touch those together. I'm going to grab a little more green with it, but it'll still be more yellow than what's down there. Back to some of our green. Cleaning my brush off. I'm going to take a little yellow. So clean my brush off, wiped it off, wipe it off again. So I think I'm just depositing too much water for some of these. All right, I like how that's going. We're going to repeat over here, and then we're going to do kind of another in-between pass if this is dry. So this section needs to dry still, so we're going to kind of pull this down in the water. The key with water is to have very horizontal strokes. So we're going to try and kind of mimic what we have going on here, but bring that down. We're going to take our blue color, which if you remember was our Winsor blue. I need to mix a little more. Winsor blue with our perylene green. Have you found the star of the show yet? Perylene green. And I'm going to just start that on the edge over here, overlapping a little bit, that's fine. Washing my brush off. Washing my brush off. And then this is mostly clean water. I'm bringing that down. Now we're going to add in our more yellow green, but I'm going to mix just a touch more of the perylene. So it's a little bit more blue tone. Water that down a bit. Clean that off. It's still very wet. Take some of our yellow. As you see, it's dirtier. It's kind of dirty yellow. You see how all my strokes are very horizontal. It's okay if they break up a bit. Let's see, grabbing a little more of just the yellow, dabbing that off, and just gonna kind of bring that in here. I'm getting a little bit of a bloom here. I'm just gonna kind of go back and forth a little bit. Going in with just some perylene, just that green. I'm gonna mix it in with our more yellow green a little bit, so it's a little bit warmer than straight from the tube. We're going to need a second pass with this, but we can get it pretty close. And then I'm going to take the perylene, adding a little more of that perylene and kind of bringing it on the edge. And we're going to do the same thing over here. We're going to take some of that yellow green that we had. I'm going to have to pick up some of what's going on here. And then into the perylene. So a little bit cooler. Cleaning my brush off, dabbing it off, and just using these strokes to kind of blend it all in. All right, it's tempting to keep playing, but I'm gonna let that go for now. We will add to it most likely later, but I don't want to overwork it right now. We're already getting a little bit of a bloom in here, which we'll need to fix later. And then I want to work on this background bit just underneath our trees while these are dry, so we can kind of really define some of these sections before we go do one more pass, at least on some of this greenery here. You know, I think I'm going to take the perylene green with that brown that we mixed. I'm going to mix those two together, kind of like this. So if this is our, see how that's brighter? It might not look like a lot, but I think it'll make a difference with what we're doing. So we're kind of just swallowing that brown that we made. So I'm going to actually go in now with, let me grab my size 6. This is my size 6 Princeton Heritage brush. I'm going to dab it and then pick up some of that gray that we kind of made, that green gray. And we're going to apply it back here. I'm actually going to like leave out a highlighted trunk. I'm thinking a little close. I'm thinking kind of right here. Adding a little more water, dabbing off the brush. And then adding a little bit of our warmer color as we get in here. Dampening my brush, wiping it off so it's a little, it's kind of a dirty brush. I'm going to add some shrubbery around here, and I want to make sure we're kind of carving out. Again, this is kind of working in the negative. And kind of up here, it's going to be a little softer. Down here, might need to be a little more crisp. So something like allowing this to kind of come up and down. See how we've kind of carved that out? Let me zoom you in a little bit. A little bit of water, dab it off. Just kind of softens it. And just kind of dabbing my brush this way helps to allow me to keep it kind of vertical, so it looks a little more grass-like. Then dabbing it this way might be more like some leaves. And I'm going to kind of leave a hint of another tree, just like we did over here. I think this one might need to be kind of set back a touch. It's just a little too bright for where it is. Sorry about that, kind of continuing down the line. And I'm doing some of the same things. We're kind of avoiding some areas, allowing things to kind of stand out that might not otherwise. Do you see how much depth we've created in here by just kind of adding that extra layer? It's very light, very watered down, and really just kind of filling things in carefully with some texture and an unsteady hand. Not necessarily the technique most people would recommend, but it worked really well for us. We can add a little extra definition by kind of going in again with just kind of a wet brush with a little bit of pigment on it. And maybe this section is a little bit darker because it's in front. And so we switching our brush this way so we get kind of a different leaf pattern. We can bring that down and kind of jump in between some of these areas. And I'm going to actually pull that all the way this way. So this didn't get quite as dark as I would have liked it to. So while this technique, it's more complicated than just working loose, the way that we often do in a lot of my tutorials where we're just kind of putting color down, where it's a lot of an experiment with color theory. It is certainly, I would say, a beginner-friendly painting technique as long as you go slow. So just come along with me, follow slowly. You know, like we're not doing anything hard here, like we're going slowly on a line. I know you can do that. You know, and then like certainly having an unsteady hand over here, anybody can do that. We're just carefully moving our brush from one side to the other, this way for grass, this way for certain leaves, and adding light layers of pigment. That's probably the hardest part. If you have a rag and you're dabbing your brush off in between laying it down so that you don't have too much pigment on, that will help immensely. So I do that a lot. You've heard me say it over and over and over again, just to make sure that you're not putting down too much water or have too much pigment on your brush. So just bringing that down here. So I hope that this is encouraging thus far. I often label my tutorials as beginner friendly because I like to think that they are, but also that, you know, like just because you're just starting out doesn't mean that you can't do some of these harder things. I'm just going in with really, I have a dirty wet brush and it's very dirty because I need to switch out my water, but I'm just kind of adding this extra layer just to kind of help define areas. Okay, being careful not to stick your hand in the paint that you've laid down over here. We're going to follow the same steps that we were talking about before, where we're going in one section at a time. So I'm going to start on this side. My brush is a little too wet, so dabbing that off. So this is more of what I'm going for. You can see that there was kind of a puddle here. I want it to be pigment laid down, not quite as much puddle. If I'm getting little puddle, I'm just dabbing it off on the side. So for this section, I'm going a little bit more for like a leaf shape. I'm still going to kind of jump around and do some of these, but when I go off, I'm going to make sure I'm getting a little bit more definition. I'm allowing things to bleed through, so like some empty spots in here to kind of show that there's, you know, some light shining through that. I'm going to keep it dark in this corner. And we might go back in and darken those later. We'll see. But it's easier to deepen things than to wish that you hadn't painted over them. And with sections like this, where kind of a darker section came down, I'm going to be careful not to paint exactly on top of it, because that creates some beautiful depth. All right, I don't love how the color is sitting. I think that's really weird. I've never seen that before, so I'm guessing it's the soap. The soap that kind of got into my pigment. It was probably on this brush, or I probably dabbed somewhere that had a little bit of soap on it when I used the resist, and it's just going to be there. So we might have to do kind of a doctored up wash. We'll see. Now we're going to go into our yellow green. I'm going to switch my water. So grab the perylene, our yellow green. I'm actually going to switch brushes. I don't know if this brush is the culprit or if it just is a victim as well, but I'm not loving it. So it's another size 10 brush. This is the Zen Art Faux Squirrel round brush. And I'm going to go in on these trees. We're going to start from the darker section. So I'm going to go into, I just mixed some of the yellow green, but I'm dipping a little bit more into the perylene green for this section. And we're going to be real messy over here. And see how that's a warmer green than down here. It's a subtle difference, but it will be helpful to define the space. Might need to go back in and cover some of those later, we'll see. All right, our yellow green, I'm going to skip over this one to this one. Be very careful not to stick your hand in your paint. And I'm just going to kind of roll with it. You know, I think I'm going to switch to the other brush. This is my size 6 brush, so this is our smaller brush again in that yellow green. I'm going to mix some more of real quick. I think the yellow might be where our soap is coming from. Although it seems to be bugging our perylene the most. Water. So washing off the brush, just rinsing it and dabbing it off. So we've got, again, that wet and a dirty brush. A little more pigment. Dab off the water, excess water. And I'm going to kind of work around this area. More pigment, bringing this in a little bit more. And what we're doing is we're just kind of carving out the darker sections from our more highlighted yellow ones. We will go in and kind of define our more golden ones soon. I'm going to kind of switch, and we're working on defining the area around this one. So this is kind of a good example of what we're doing. See how that kind of carved out this little leaf out of this area? By just going over with these different kind of trails of leaves. And then we're going to come from this side with more of our yellow and perylene green. Too wet. I just dabbed it off. My brush is still very dirty. Connect these two. Little water, dabbing it off on my rag. All right, I'm gonna go in with a little bit darker here to help define this a little bit more. So we're gonna add a little bit more of our perylene in with this yellow green. Rinsing it, dabbing it off. We're just carving out the shape of our tree. Trees are often shaped funny, so don't be afraid of giving your tree a funny shape. Especially in nature, it's just going to be shaped kind of funny. All right, I'm going back in with our more yellow-green just to kind of put another pass on this one, just a little bit. Rinsing it off, dabbing it off. All right, now carefully, mostly yellow with some green. Well, it's pretty green, but it's a lot more green than what we were working with before. I'm going to kind of add in back here. Just some little sections. All right, is this what you were expecting when you came to paint with me today? Okay, so we're gonna add a little more definition down here. We're gonna kind of work down. We have some mess to fix here. You can see it's got a lot of texture. We're gonna wanna soften that because we want this to kind of shine through and be a little more focal point, and this to just kind of hide it, make it look interesting, like, oh, I wanna go explore in there. So I'm going to grab my size 10 brush real quick, rinse that off. First in my dirty water, then in my clean water to help save that clean water a little longer. I'm going to go in with our yellow-green. Let's mix some more of that. I would say that it looks very sap greeny right now. And I'm going to go in and just kind of define some of this down here. So see how thick that is and how that's now like a bullseye? I'm actually going to put that off to the side, that brush off to the side, grab that 6 again, clean it off, dab it off, and we're just going to help to spread that around. I don't hate the idea of the edge being kind of irregular, so we're going to let it do that. Dabbing it off to get some softer chunks in there. Grabbing more pigment, bringing that along. Actually, I'm going to grab this one because it's holding a little more wet. And then I'm going to just bring this up here. So you're able to get some that are like nice and thin. Now I'm going to do less of that over here because I want this focus to be in here. So I'm going to let this kind of soften up. Dab the pigment in down here, keep that nice and concentrated. Then I'm going to take this brush and rinse it, dab it so it's still dirty. It's still going to kind of carry my pigment nicely, but it's not as full. Dabbing it off. Just going to let this kind of stay focal. But then see how we just have less of that down here. Rinsing off my little brush, dabbing it off, and I'm just going to pull it. And just spread it. I'm even going to spread it too far there. Rinsing that brush off, dabbing it off. Not a full clean, it's still dirty. Rinse, dab, just bringing this down a bit. I like that. All right, so we're going to repeat that over here. We're going to do more of our texture, which actually, quickly, I'm going to dab that clean brush off. wipe it off. I'm going to get rid of some of this texture. Wiping it off again. There's just a little too much for how much emphasis I want over here. All right, now we're going to repeat over here, maybe with a little bit of the Perylene. So mixing it in with our yellow green just to get it a touch deeper. A little more green, a little more of the dark green. Rinsing that brush off, wiping it off, and pulling. All right, I am going to grab some of the Perylene green, just kind of a glaze, and I'm going to pull from over here. Rinse, dab, dab again. Rinse, dab. All right, I'm going to pull from the blue green, mix that with our Perylene green. So the blue that we mixed for our sky. And kind of bring that in a little bit more. Especially down here. So it's damp, it'll move our pigment. Rinse, dab. Rinse, dab. I'm going to clear that off again. Rinse, dab. Rinse, dab again. I wouldn't say I'm the most confident with making water. So if you're wondering why I'm like going back and forth constantly, I'm still kind of figuring this out. I've done it before and it turned out, but I kind of just make it work. Rinsing and dabbing again. Surprise, surprise, just to kind of blend this in. And add a little bit of our yellow green, just a touch with some water. Dabbing it off though, so it's not too much, to get kind of the glow of this tree that we have. Rinse, dab, pick up a little bit more. Rinse, dab, to pull it around. A little more green. A little more green. Rinse, dab, pigment. All right, I don't hate where this is going. Let's go ahead and add our trunks in before I get too carried away and completely lose my mind. And then we'll see where we're going from there. So I'm going to grab some, you guessed it, Perylene green. I'm going to grab a little bit of our Winsor red and start with those two, see what we need to add in. And then I'm going to push down a little harder and pull that down, and that will lighten everything. So we'll be adding kind of shadows to the side of this, and then just let this kind of tuck back in here. Our shadows will go on this side. Dabbing that off. And then dabbing some of the pigment in here where the shadows would be stronger. And then I'm going to add some branches in here. and kind of being tucked in over there. See how that kind of continues off? But it's also going to branch out over here. Rinse it, wipe it off, blend it together, rinse and repeat. I generally work best if I'm going from thickest to thinnest. Now that's me. If you're gonna have to kind of experiment to figure out what is easiest for you. But see how that was kind of clumsy thick? It'd be better if I did worked that way. So unfortunately at this point my camera card was full and I didn't realize it for a while, so I filled in the trunk on the left hand side, but while I was emptying my memory card I decided to charge my microphone, and when I put it on wrong and I didn't test it, so none of this next section the audio didn't record. So I'm going to do my best to do a voiceover, explain kind of what I was thinking. There's going to be a lot of repeated elements, just like what we've been doing, where there's, a lot of slowly added pigment and then a lot of the perylene green and just kind of working in that way. So I'm really sorry. It's just this section and we'll kind of add the final details with audio, but just for this section I wanted to let you know that's what happened. So right now what I'm doing, I'm going in with the pure perylene green and I'm just adding some reeds kind of to our foreground section, and we're just going to slowly build that up. We're basically going to be deepening this left hand section quite a bit in order to get it as deep and dark as we want it to be, because we want it to be kind of silhouetted where our light is coming through kind of that back section. So I just slowly built up these grasses with these additional passes, and if it was a little too watered down, I just went over it again. So you can see I'm continuing to build this up, and eventually I merge into kind of like a hedge or more of a traditional shrubbery rather than these long grasses. And I did have to go over it with an additional pass, and I added some red into that perylene green in order to desaturate it a bit. I can't remember if I did that here or later. And then I took a more of a wash of it, had some smaller flicks here at the base and kind of blended it in before I went in with the brown again in order to deepen this kind of sandy ground area. And then similar to what we've been doing this whole time is I'm kind of working real deep on one side and allowing it to lighten up, kind of blending that out. And then we're going to work a little bit deeper on that other section, and having kind of that vignette will help to draw attention toward the area that I want to be more in attention, and kind of that center section where eventually I want to look like you would want to stand. I did raise it up a little bit. I think if I were to do this again, I would raise it up a little bit more, and so it would cut into the water a little bit more, but I think that having it there as kind of that visual of like, I want to go and stand there and see more, I think would draw the viewer in a little bit more, just make it a little bit more alluring, a little more interesting. Once that was done, I went and I deepened that left-hand side corner a little bit more, just adding another layer. This I definitely had some red in there in order to like really get it nice and deep and desaturate it a little bit in order to kind of build it up to where I want it to be. But because this was now deeper, I needed to deepen everything else. The next section I work on is this trunk here on the left hand side, especially because it's silhouetted. I really need it to be deep. So I really wanted to go back in now that my paint was dried a little bit more, because originally it was just too wet to get it as saturated as I wanted it to be. Most of it is going to be silhouetted, so it will be in shadow because the highlight would be on the other side where the light is coming from. But there are sections a little bit on the left, and then you can see kind of at the fork where it's a little bit lighter, and I allowed it to be that way. Now I'm going over another pass onto the greenery up here, some of the leaves. It was just too splotchy. I hated it. So I went over it with a slightly warmer green. So I mixed our yellow green in with some more of the perylene in order to get just a little bit better mix. I don't know, it just wasn't kind of going correctly. So I'm going over with this big brush and I'm being really sloppy with it. It just wasn't working by like having the texture in there. So I thought might as well try and just apply a nice deep layer over all of it, get it down to the color that we want, and then if we need to do a little bit of lifting, we can do that later, which, spoiler alert, we didn't end up doing. So I went over the entire tree and filled in some of kind of the openings that we had, and I will actually be filling them in a little bit more before going in on kind of our real background tree layer again. And this is where we got kind of messy. I definitely could have gone darker in that left-hand section, but here, as we're playing around with this, I got the idea to have kind of some of our sunburst. So I'm deepening this, and I realized that if we played around with kind of the angle of the light, it kind of looked like the light was streaming in through the leaves, and I really liked that. So in order to get this effect, I grabbed a second brush. So I'm working with one brush that is damp with some pigment on it and one that is just damp. So the red one, this one, is just damp, and I'm pushing it down and I'm dragging it through the paint that I already have. I'm doing this twice. So once it's kind of getting it wet, and the second time it's picking up pigment. In between, I'm rinsing my brush real quick, dabbing it off on my rag that's down there, and then I'm going back in. So it's not sopping wet, but there's definitely enough water on it in order to kind of pick up some of that pigment. And then I'm going back in with the black brush that has a little bit of that pigment on it, and it's a little more wet, so it's more of a glaze. And I'm applying some of this color and deciding where the next kind of ray of sunlight is going to come in. Now, this doesn't have to be like super scientific. I ended up going a lot back and forth a lot because I was able to pick up a lot of that pigment with the wet brush, and so I got a little gutsy with it. But you'll see how like I left a section for like a small spot. Now with the wet brush, going in, pulling hard, dabbing it off, and kind of going again. This is where I'm like so frustrated that I lost this audio because I wish I could tell you what I was thinking. But honestly, at this point, I know for sure I was saying something like, well, if we don't end up liking it, we can always, fill it back in later. But obviously, I ended up liking it because we did keep this section. But I can't remember every single step. I just know that my system was I had one brush that was pretty clean but damp, and then the other that had kind of that pigment on it. So I was doing a lot of dragging and picking up pigment. There I'm just dabbing some of it off because I need a little bit extra help in picking up the pigment in that way. All right, at this point, see the areas that I'm picking up? It's a little harder to see, so I like back up and you can't really see what I'm putting down. So I went in with my more pigmented brush and I'm kind of outlining the sections that I have already established are going to be kind of the sunbursts that are coming through. So I'm just kind of tracing it down, and I am starting in this case at one of the leaves in the tree in order to make it look like that is blocking the sun from coming in and illuminating, what's around it. Now, I am trying to be careful not to run into the grasses down below that we've already highlighted. I don't want to cover up those areas because if the sun is shining on them, obviously those would be highlighted even more. So just something to kind of keep in mind. But I went back and forth with, sometimes I needed to pull up more pigment and sometimes I needed to put extra pigment in kind of the areas that weren't being highlighted or didn't have kind of that sunburst on them so that they actually showed up. Now, if I were to do this again, you kind of using the same section, and by the way, this one that I just put in, I end up adding pigment back on top of it. It just kind of went too far, so don't add that one in. But see, here we go, adding pigment back in. I thought I did it later. But if I could kind of go back and, plan this from the beginning and add those in, I would have a lot more of my masking fluid where the sunbursts are coming in. Now, that would, again, require a lot more planning and a lot more discipline for me from the get-go. But just something to kind of think about is I would have had, more aggressive highlights in those areas, where the light is hitting the water or where the light is hitting kind of those grasses in order to really emphasize what's happening there. All right, now it's time to take off some of that masking fluid. I like to use a white eraser or honestly my finger. I tend to be kind of lazy. I like to feel around for the masking fluid, but a white eraser is a great option as well. and I'm just kind of feeling along and just rubbing on the masking fluid to get it off. A lot of my masking fluid here in the grasses didn't stick, so I wish I had gone a little bit more aggressively on it because they definitely showed up in the water. Again, not all of them. Some of them ended up kind of flaking off. I needed to be a little bit more aggressive, a little heavier handed, but in the end I think it's going to work out okay. And we're going to have a good painting. Now I'm going in lightly with a light glaze over some of the areas in order to soften them a bit. Some areas I still want to be white, but if everything is white, then they're not as special. So I'm just going over with kind of that warm yellow green in order to just kind of knock them back a little bit so that they still have a little bit of that glow quality, but they're not quite as aggressive. Now, because they didn't show up as well in the grasses, I'm actually going to go through with, again, kind of the yellow-green, but more yellow, kind of a dirtier yellow, in order to kind of carve out some of these areas in order to give them a little bit more of a glow. It's going to be subtle. I'm not going for lighthouse here, but we want there to be a little bit of a sparkle, a little bit of something kind of magical happening over there. After all, that is kind of where we are focusing. We want to see, we want the light to look very ethereal and inviting and exciting. And so by adding a little bit more contrast in here, a little bit more texture, a little bit more emphasis, we kind of capture that. We, bring the viewer in, we invite the viewer along, give them something to look at. And again, I keep saying this, but create kind of that mystery. That's kind of what I'm going for with this. This is a little bit magical, a little bit inviting. I don't know, maybe I'm just in a fantasy mood or something like that right now, but that is totally what I'm going for right now. All right, once that was complete, we zoomed back out and I took a minute to pause and just kind of step back. This is where we're going to lean back in our chair, we're going to squint a little bit, and I saw that up here, a lot of the areas that we had kind of left for, maybe the sky peeking through. For another composition, that would be ideal. You'd want to have some airiness in some of your trees. It gives it a little bit more life. However, for this like moodier, a little bit more mysterious, where we're trying to kind of create this vignette and cause this interest here in the center, it was too distracting. So we had kind of the same thing on both sides where I'm covering up some of these openings. And if nothing else, I'm softening them. And so I definitely did that. See, I'm just going really haphazardly, very kind of lazily, and just covering those up to soften them. Not a lot of pigment on my brush, but enough to cover up some of those more stark areas. I also saw that I needed a little bit more of a vignette on this right-hand side, this lower right-hand side. So I already started on that. I just went in with the Perylene Green with that little bit of our ultramarine blue, and I'm blending that in. I'm just going to slowly bring it in. You'll see that, you can see through this brush strokes that I have. That's because there's, not a ton of water, not a ton of pigment on my brush. So it's just a light glaze that I'm slowly adding over here and I'm blending in. Again, with water, we keep everything very horizontal, and so we're kind of putting these nice big strokes in here. Still working with that same color, so it's very cool, it's very dark. And then I'm going in with our warmer green, and as we're dealing with reflections and we're more closer to the light source, and kind of blending that in here. All right, sorry again about the audio mishaps that we've had. It's just kind of the nature of this competition or this drawing challenge. I just don't have as much time to fuss with things. But anyway, I talked to my husband about it last night. This is the next day after we finished everything. And he gave me a couple composition tips that I thought were really valuable. First, he said that the water does not look like water. So we're going to add kind of another glaze just to kind of, I get too blendy. He was like, is this water or grass? So we're just going to kind of add some of these in here to kind of look a little bit more like water, kind of rough it up a little bit. So you can see I'm kind of working in this section a little bit just to kind of bring it over. And this is very light. You can see how it's fading. I don't have a ton of pigment on my brush, so some of it that you're seeing is even just the water. Okay, let's add a little more here. Again, keeping it very horizontal. Staying away from my little sun. And if you're new to my channel, my husband is a landscape painter. He's not a YouTube person. That's just not his thing. So he will probably never do a tutorial with me. He did humor me once on Instagram Live and it didn't save. So I guess never say never, but yeah, probably not. All right, I'm thinking that looks a little more watery. We'll see what he says later. And then he also recommended, I'm going to grab some of our brown, adding a little more texture down here to make it look like there are rocks or sand and make it a little more detailed as the foreground. I'm kind of doing the same thing I did with the water, but just kind of bouncing around a little bit. I don't want to add too much detail. Oops, sorry about that. I don't want to add too much detail there. All right, we're also going to add another glaze here just to deepen that and get rid of this hole where you get kind of trapped. By adding this in here, I can definitely see how I've created something to look at, which unfortunately, since it's kind of trapped in there, draws your eye in. Just tapping some of this extra pigment in there. To kind of deepen that. We'll see how that goes. I also noticed up here, some of these areas, kind of same along those same lines, just drawing your eye a little too much. Another something that he mentioned that I thought was a valid point, but I'm going to disregard because he's my husband, I can do that. And this is my painting, is he said to have something over here. And I do kind of like the idea of, okay, like having, like framing it in, since we've got this larger dark section. We could add some more over here. Maybe we will add a couple, just like the reeds that we have over here, although it's going to be a little tough to get it deep enough. I'm going to go into our green. Just to kind of frame this in. You know what? I hate it when he's right. Which is most of the time. All right, gonna add a little bit of our red in, just like we did over here. To just deepen that a bit more. All right, I do think that that's better. Man. All right, we're gonna call that good. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, that you are enjoying Garden-tober and the prompts that we've provided. And until next time, happy painting.